So the fair was immensely influential and popular, especially in the United States. But Beaux-Arts architecture had its origins, as I said, with the École de Beaux-Arts and really out of Paris. And the example I want to show you for the sort of origination is one of the earliest examples of Beaux-Arts, and that's the Paris Opera House from between 1861, finished in 1875 by Charles Garnier. And I have just a few images. This is an exterior image of the front facade, and this really lays out the characteristics that are common with Beaux-Arts. It's neoclassical in form. This isn't a specific revival of particular Greek or Roman building. It's just using Greek and Roman architectural forms, sort of cobbled together in whatever manner the architect wanted. We see some Roman arches, we see the Corinthian capitals, we see entablatures, but it also has a copper dome and a pyramidal gable roof behind that, lots of gilding and ornamentation throughout. We also see very, very strong symmetry, and this is a major characteristic of Beaux-Arts architecture is even symmetry. There's almost always going to be a central axis point at the center with even facade on either side, often with a main central entry that is highlighted. In this case, there's actually multiple entries along the base of the building, but in other examples we'll see there will be a very prominent, maybe temple front entryway at the very center. And also this style worked well for planning and for creating grandiose spaces, especially something like an opera house. There is a massive lobby, again, over detailed and ornamented and gilded with all these electric light bulbs and so forth, and a grand central staircase that leads the crowds, from the lobby up into the various balconies where they can see the show. But this serves also as not just as a functional, but also as a ornamental purpose, because the opera was the place to be seen, to see and be seen for the rich and famous. The Kardashians of the day would have been at the opera, and they would have wanted to be wearing the ladies would have been wearing their newest, fanciest ball gowns, and the way to show that off was to go up and down this grand staircase so that everyone else could see you and gossip and talk about what you were wearing that day. And then, of course, the main auditorium, which also has elaborate decorations and gildings and is lined with these balconies where, if you had even more money, you would sit in the balconies, or you could get the cheap seats here in the main auditorium aspect. So this is kind of the origins of what Beaux-Arts architecture is. And we see examples come out of the States a little bit before and definitely after the Columbian Exposition. Like I say, the Columbian Exposition isn't the origin of Beaux-Arts architecture, it's what really popularizes it. And McKim, Mead, and White and their Boston Public Library is one of the first major examples in the United States. It was started in 1887, finished in 1895. And McKim, Mead, and White were one of the most prominent architecture firms in the country in the late 19th and early 20th century. They were definitely the most prestigious New York City firm, and New York City being the biggest city in the country. They had clients all up and down the East Coast, as well as throughout the country. Really, Burnham and Root were their main competitors based in Chicago. And McKim and White were the two primary designers of the firm. They had trained under H.H. Richardson. They did not adapt his Richardsonian Romanesque style, but he was such a talented architect that they learned a great deal from him. They did other styles as well. They worked a lot in the colonial revival and so forth, but their big grand public buildings were mostly in the Beaux-Arts style. And so here we see the front facade of the Boston Public Library. Now, it's not quite as elaborate and overly decorated as the Paris Opera House, but we see that neoclassical architecture. We see that the Roman arches along the upper facade and the three Roman arches at the center really distinguishing the entryway and everything is symmetrical on this center arch and very even on both sides. And one of the things about Beaux-Arts architecture is it didn't matter if you needed a window in a particular place. You had to put it there in order to maintain the symmetry. So sometimes you'll even see blind windows. You'll have an opening, but it's just a stone or brick wall within that instead of a window. It all depended on the overall exterior form and design. It didn't necessarily have to relate to the interior function. And this is something that was in contrast to what Sullivan and the other Chicago school architects had been promoting, which was that the form should follow function. And this sort of breaks from that and was therefore sort of two contrasting approaches to architecture, but Beaux-Arts largely wins, and the Chicago school kind of dies out in the early 1900s, and Beaux-Arts becomes very popular. So here we see the floor plans. On the left is the ground floor plan, and we see at the center the main entrance hall and another grand staircase and plan, and that leads you to the upper floor where the main reading room is down here at the bottom, base hall. And then there are stacks and offices and smaller reading rooms and lecture halls scattered throughout, and it's a donut shape with an interior courtyard. And if I show you, here's the walking in the main entrance. So here, similar to what we saw at Paris, is a entry hall with a grand staircase leading you up to the main reading room on the second floor. And the view of the reading room is very Roman in character. This looks like a Roman barrel vaulted basilica, even with the coffering on the ceilings here, to create this big, large space where back in the day you would come to the library, you would order a book and they would bring it to you. You didn't just wander around the bookshelves like you do today. Their other great work was Pennsylvania Station in New York City. This was a railroad station built between 1904 and 1910. And the floor plan of Pennsylvania Station, this was a massive building. It took up an entire city block, and they needed an immense amount of area for ticketing, for waiting, for offices, railroad offices, restrooms, and so forth. And then the concourse actually was underground. Show you the next slide. We have an elevation, but on the bottom is a section, and at the bottom of the section, this is where the train concourse is. And so all of that was buried underground. This is in contrast to the railroad stations we saw in the early Industrial Revolution, which had those huge iron concourses at grade. At this point, they're able to bury them as subways, essentially, and the concourse for waiting rooms and so forth are up above that. And the design they picked is based on the Roman baths of Caracalla, which were a giant bathhouse for ancient Rome. And McKean and White sort of felt like, well, we need to have this giant building that'll hold, thousands of people at any given time coming and going to their trains. And they felt that the inspiration of this large Roman bath was a good fit for that. So this is an example. It's neoclassical, but it actually has stronger, almost more direct ties to actual Roman building. Here we see a historic view of it, and the waiting room is this grand space with these huge Roman vaulted or Roman arched windows that lets light into the entry or into the waiting room. And this is a rendering of the baths of Caracalla, which are really just ruins now and then, but they were well documented, and artists and archaeologists had sort of created imagery of what they would have looked like in their height of the Roman era. And so McKimmey and White would have been familiar with this and decided to base their railroad station, a modern early 20th century industrial building, on an ancient Roman bathhouse. Kind of ironic, I suppose, but it worked for the planning needs that they had. And here we see the main waiting room, which does incorporate the Industrial Revolution, open iron steel framing and skylights to let in lots of light. It looks a little like those train concourses of the earlier examples we had seen. But the exterior form is completely disassociated with this modern technology. And this is, again, something that the modern Chicago architects really disliked about the Beaux-Arts architecture. Excuse me. Unfortunately, with changes in railroads in the later 20th century, this became somewhat obsolete. And in 1963, despite a lot of protests, the building was torn down. The railroad concourse remained underground, and the powers that be, the railroad, sort of felt like, hey, we can still have a station underground, and we can put generic access to it above grade, but we don't need this giant railroad hall upstairs anymore. And so it was torn down, and it actually is the site of Madison Square Garden now. So I suppose we lost this building for something that's just as famous, but it was a huge loss, and preservationists were really upset. This is one of the acts of destruction of urban renewal that spurs the preservation movement in the 1960s. So Chicago has several of its examples of the Beaux-Arts, starting with the Art Institute of Chicago from 1893. This was built at the same time of the fair and was meant to be an art hall for Chicago, a permanent home for the arts in Chicago. And Shepley, Rutten, and Coolidge are the architects. This is the successor firm to H.H. Richardson, actually. But again, they're not working any longer in his Romanesque revival style, but in the Beaux-Arts. And so we see their example of a Beaux-Arts neoclassical architecture being built at the same time as these temporary buildings down in Hyde Park at the Columbian Exposition. This is the view of it as it was originally built. It's obviously a lot bigger now, but even the bronze lions are out front. Those are original to the building. But we see the symmetry of the front facade. We see a kind of temple front that protrudes out and makes it very clear where one enters, and you have this grand staircase that rises up from Michigan Avenue, and at least it was historically before all the different wings and additions. The neoclassical arcades and columns extended all the way around the building. Here's a view of it as we see from Michigan Avenue today with the famous lions. There's no question about where one enters this. And in a way, the planning aspects of Beaux-Arts makes a lot of sense for a public building like this. Unlike Frank Lloyd Wright, who liked to hide his front door, you can really, when you have a public building, you really need people to know exactly where they can enter. And so this symmetrical, entry facade like this really works well for a public building like this. And like the other examples we've been seeing, the Art Institute has a grand entry hall with this grand staircase. And, you can walk up the stairs. We see more neoclassical architecture here. Another view shows some of the architectural ornament. Ironically, some of the great Chicago school ornaments that were salvaged as they got torn down in Chicago are now in this neoclassical Beaux-Arts style art museum. So there's a little bit of a contrast in there, but it's a fantastic, if you haven't gone up in the architectural gallery here, it's a beautiful space and a place where you can see a lot of Burnham and Root and Louis Sullivan details of their buildings. Another great example is the Chicago Public Library, which is now the Cultural Center. This is from 1897. Shepley, Rutten, and Coolidge had done such a nice job on the Art Institute that the Public Library Board hired them to come back and design the library for themselves. So you may know this now as the Cultural Center, but this actually was built to be the main branch of the Chicago Public Library. So we see a lot of similarities to McKinley's and White's Boston Library with the Roman arches and the very neoclassical architecture. This is a little bit odd in that the main entrance is not along Michigan Avenue, where you might think it would be. There are actually two entrances, one here on the south side and an opposite one on the north side. And those are symmetrical on those elevations, but one would generally expect to see the main entry be off Michigan Avenue. I can't honestly say why that is, but it is a bit unusual layout for that. And if you have not been in here, this is completely open to the public when we're not on lockdown for the pandemic. It is an incredible place to go in and visit. You don't have to pay a fee or anything like that, and they often have exhibitions and art shows and so forth inside that you can see for free. This is off the south entrance, which is probably the best one to go in. Has a grand entry and staircase with marble and mosaic tile. It is exquisite, and you come up to what was the old reading room, which is this domed space with a Tiffany dome, one of the most incredible Tiffany works in the country. This incredible dome, which was restored about 10 years ago. They did a lot of restoration on this, and it is just an incredible space to be in, both with the mosaic tile in the arches below that and the glass Tiffany dome and the light fixture hanging from that. So check this out. A lot of people have weddings here. It's just an incredible place to check out. Okay.